Okay, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday, November 5th, and this is Agential Topics. Agential Topics is a study group put on by Talking Octopus, which is a nonprofit formed to build a physical model of biological agency. And Agential Topics is the study group where we try to figure out what biological agency is. So today we have Mike Levin for a second time as a guest and member to present his idea of Platonic forms, which I heard about for the first time the last time he came to Agential Topics, and since then has developed into a big symposium and a whole community in a way. So this is very exciting, and without adhering to our tradition, I will refrain from introducing the guest very much and just let him go ahead and dive right into his fascinating idea.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, and thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to discuss these ideas with you guys. Just to be clear, most of the time when I talk, I talk about things that I'm, reasonably sure of because of experiments we've done and things like this. And so here I'm sort of further out on a limb as far as some conceptual frameworks that I think we might want to consider. But anyway, so let's talk about it. If you want to see the whole thing, there's a preprint which is here, where I sort of very carefully go through what I think the current argument is. And then there's a talk on our Platonic Space Symposium webpage that goes, it's probably an hour and a half that goes into all of the details. So here, what I'm going to do today, because I have 15 minutes to introduce this, what I'm going to do today is try to just give very bare bones arguments for what I think is going on, and then we can dive into the examples as you guys want, because there are many specific things to be said about each of these. So here's the outline of how I tend to think about this. So the first thing I do is I generalize the notion of patterns to be forms of anatomy, but also specific set points of physiology and behavior and so on. So all of those things are patterns to me. The next thing that I do is to view morphogenesis as a homeostatic or even homeodynamic process that aims toward a specific outcome. That is, I do not believe that the hypothesis that open loop ideas of complexity and emergence are sufficient to explain and make use of what we see in biology. I think we have to model these things as specific goal-seeking systems. Then we have to ask the question, well, where do the specific goals come from? And in particular, where do they come from in systems that have not been specifically selected for certain outcomes? So we have to get beyond environment and genetics and things like that. Then comes the proposal that there is a structured, ordered space of patterns that biology exploits and that physics is constrained by, that basically these things are not a random grab bag of what some people call regularities or just things that hold in our world. I have a, I guess, more optimistic view that this is actually a structured space that we can investigate, and we can talk about what that means for physicalism and causation and explanation and so on. And then there are some other sort of further claims that we can talk about, which is that what's going on, I think, in physical and especially biological systems is not limited to complex, brainy, or even living kinds of things. I think the phenomena that we're talking about here go all the way down. And then there's a specific research program that at this point, I think 4 or 5 people in my lab are involved in. So it's a very kind of practical thing. It's not just ideas. So now going back to this to just kind of say what we've done for each one. So the first, the status of each, because I want to be very careful about which of these things are total conjecture and which of these things I think are on solid ground. So the first thing is a proposal. It's a proposal for unification and for erasing boundaries between disciplines. So that I think that forms of anatomical structure, of physiological dynamics and behavior should all be thought of using the same tools. I don't think these are wildly different things. In morphogenesis, we have now for 25 plus years provided specific experimental evidence that, in fact, tools that are used to study goal-directed cognitive systems are useful in these other areas of anatomy, of physiology, of gene expression, and so on. So there, I think I'm on very solid ground. This is just experimental results. Then we have provided novel model systems, such as xenobots, anthrobots, and some other things whose properties really can't in any useful way be derived from the evolutionary history that the standard organisms have had. So again, I think these are experimental results. Then comes what I think is a metaphysical position. I can't prove that that's the case, but I do think it's useful in the sense of driving a research agenda to posit that the space of these patterns that we observe is not some random thing that we are just going to write down in our big book of emergent surprises, that we really should be investigating this space. And then I think we have provided and will, in the next couple of papers that are coming out, provide some experimental evidence of really minimal systems that are exhibiting not just unpredictability, not just complexity or perverse instantiation or those kinds of things, but competencies that would be recognized by behavioral scientists. So that's data, and then the research program is actually underway. So that's the status. So a few points about all of this. First of all, I'm going to try to give the strongest defense of all this I can, but I just want to be clear that I think all of this is very, sort of front end stuff, in the sense that we don't know anything about any of this really. And, when people say, well, what if, couldn't you be wrong? Absolutely. I expect most of the things we say at this frontier at this point eventually to be in some sense wrong. And there are better versions coming. But for now, these are the best arguments I can make. So we'll do that. The next thing to keep in mind is when I say Platonic space, I do not mean that I'm defending Plato's specific views to whatever extent we even know what those were. There have been lots of critiques of Plato's views in particular, and I have no allegiance to try to hold on to that. All I'm trying to do is piggyback on the idea that mathematics in general has, I think, already has been telling us that physicalism is insufficient, and that's all I mean by this. And maybe at some point I have to come up with a different term to distance myself from Plato in particular. But for now, I think it's good because there are a lot of mathematicians who know exactly what I mean when I say Platonic space. So I think that's useful. And then I make several extensions of the standard thing that Platonist mathematicians think of. And these are, first of all, that Platonic space does not just contain low agency mathematical objects, but it also contains some much higher agency dynamic forms that would be recognized as kinds of minds. Okay. And then the second thing is that I've been working on some ways to erase the distinction between agents that have thoughts as patterns in some excitable cognitive medium. In other words, erasing the distinction between thoughts and thinkers, because I think that's very powerful, because that reminds us that we are not physical beings that somehow get invaded by patterns from that space. We are the patterns. Okay, and we can talk about all of that. There was a third thing which clearly I didn't cut and paste correctly, because for some reason this is duplicated. So we'll skip that. I don't remember what it was supposed to be. We can talk about this notion of preformationism and explanations and where patterns in general, quote unquote, come from when we try to explain things. And then we can talk about what causality means in this case, and what does it mean for non-physical mathematical truths and things like this to impact the physical world and to constrain physical events and to enable biology and so on. That requires some thinking about what do we really mean by explanation and causation. And then the final thing is, some people have said, well, look, as wild as all this previous bioelectric stuff was and so on, now you've really done it. I mean, this is really woo, is what some people have said. And all I can say is I don't know what could be more woo than the basic, what I take to be the basic state of mathematics, which is you start with something like set theory or logic, and then eventually you get to find out the specific value of E and Feigenbaum's constant and things like this. If that's not woo, I don't know what is. I don't think I have anything much wilder to add to that. I think that mathematics has been telling us for a long time that that physicalism is dead, and that I think is the basis of everything I'm going to say. And so, I don't know how much wilder we can get than that. So just to kind of say a couple of other things. I'm for sure not the first person to have some of these ideas. There are, of course, some ancient traditions that have been thinking on these lines for a very long time, and there have been modern physicists who have gone in this direction. So, Heisenberg and Whitehead and various other people. And so, one thing that you can imagine is that what we call physics is basically the behavioral science of systems that are constrained by specific patterns. In other words, I turn the typical pyramid of the sciences upside down, and I'll say that I think it's behavior science at the bottom, and everything else is sort of an elaboration of that. And so I think we call physics the study of those kinds of things that are constrained by it. And what I mean is, if you ask why do the fermions do this or that, eventually you get an answer. Well, because this mathematical structure has certain symmetries, that's why. And so that's what I mean there. But biology, I think, is something else. By what we tend to call biology are things that are enriched by these patterns. In other words, they take advantage of those patterns. They're not, I think the notion of constraints is important, but this is not just about constraints. This is also about enablements, and the idea that you get what I call free lunches, or maybe heavily discounted lunches, which means that evolution, by making certain interfaces, evolution inherits from this Platonic space of patterns all kinds of useful stuff that it did not have to evolve from scratch. You save time and energy and effort by taking advantage of these things that you get, not quite for free, because you still have to have the interface, but you get more out of it than you put in. And the other thing that maybe just to mention is what I mean by the causality, and the idea is that, if you want to understand why the cicadas are coming out at 13 and 17 years as a biologist, you might eventually end up with a story that, well, they're trying to avoid predator cycles, and if it was 12 years, then every 2-year, every 3-year, 4-year, 6-year predator would come out and get you. So 13 and 17 are great, and then you say, okay, well, what's special about those numbers? And then you say, well, those are prime. And then you say, okay, but why those numbers? And then that's it. Now you're in the math department again. And as far as I can tell, most things, if you just keep asking why long enough, everything seems to end up in the math department. And the notion of causality that I mean here is simply that if the distribution of primes were different, then the cicadas would be doing something different. And so the facts that are discovered by mathematicians have real implications for what happens in the physical world. But the reverse is much trickier. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but it's much trickier. There's nothing you can do in the physical world that's going to change the value of E, or the distribution of primes, or the Feigenbaum's constant, and so on. Yeah, and so our experimental model system for all this kind of stuff are novel chimeric and bioengineered systems that have not existed before. So xenobots and anthrobots and other things that have all kinds of amazing, very specific properties. I show them in my talk, so I don't have time to do it here. But they have very specific properties, and when we talk about why those specific properties, we really have two choices. Most people, certainly in my field, when I say, hey, how come this happens? How come these gene regulatory networks can do associative learning, or why do the xenobots do this or that? What people tell me is, well, it's emergent. And I say, well, what does that mean? And they say, well, these are just facts that hold in our world. That's it. And I find that pessimistic, and I find it kind of Mysterian, because it suggests that it's a notion of emergence as surprise, and that basically when we come across these things, we'll write them down in our big book of emergence, and that'll be that. And I prefer to think that there's much as the mathematicians think that this is actually a structured space of patterns that we can investigate, and that gives us a research agenda. And I think that these synthetic morphology beings and various other minimal systems are vehicles or periscopes that we can use to explore that latent space. And so my argument, I'll just go through this really quickly, and then I'll stop. The argument might go like this. There are specific facts of mathematics. We can call them forms, and there are various examples of these things. And many of these are very specific, and they're surprising, and they're forced on you once you choose some very basic assumptions. This underlies some, not all, but some mathematicians claim that these things are discovered and not invented. You know, you start with something pretty minimal, and before you know it, you've managed to discover some very complex things that could not have been otherwise. So for some such patterns, they serve as explanations in both biology and physics. In other words, if you keep pressing in both of those disciplines, you keep pressing why, the answer eventually tends to end up some property of some mathematical object. Going in reverse is much harder. You know, there tends to be, again, as far as I understand, no aspect of the physical world, meaning no universal constants that you could have set to a different value, no amount of history in terms of biological selection and things like that, that would tell you why a certain pattern is the way it is, or allow you to change it. And so this is my notion of causality is you know, you tweak one side and see if the other side changes, and then you do vice versa, and you have some idea of who's control, you know, which is controlling which. So based on this, and again, I don't think I'm saying anything that Pythagoras and probably many people before have already said, that I don't think we can say that all the facts are physical facts. I don't think that's viable at all. I think it's clear that there are facts that come from another space that is not described by what we mean as physics. You can try to add it to physics, but I think that stretches the notion of physics beyond anything that's useful. And so I would for the time being anyway, we can call that domain the Platonic space. And so then I make an optional sort of metaphysical claim. I think this is not a random collection, it's a structured space. So now we have a research program. We can map out the contents of that space. We can try to understand the relationship between that interface and between interfaces we make in the physical world and whatever patterns they channel. And then here come two things that I think are basically just skeptical positions. The first is, I don't think we can assume that the low agency kinds of, and by the way, that I've even been challenged on that. There was a mathematician in our Platonic space seminar that even pushed me on that and said, why do you call them low agency? You don't know, you haven't tested them. And she's right. She's absolutely right. But I don't think we can assume that the models that mathematics uses encompasses all the inhabitants of that space. It's entirely possible that some may have to be described by other tools, for example, the tools of behavior science. And so it's possible, and it seems to me likely, that some of these patterns that make their way into physics and biology are recognizable as behavioral propensities or competencies, aka kinds of minds. And therefore, you can say something interesting. You can say that actually dualism is quite viable. I mean, it has a terrible, it gets a really bad rap nowadays, but I think it's actually viable. So the mathematics is telling us this. We already knew it was true in physics and biology. Maybe it's also relevant in cognitive science. And then there's another skeptical position that is, I don't think we can assume that biological materials, evolutionary search, or any of those things have any kind of monopoly on hosting these kind of patterns. I don't see, we have no idea why any of those things would be required. And so maybe some much simpler things that we're not used to thinking in that way, algorithms, robots, you know, various kinds of other systems, should be examined for these surprising ingressions. Maybe it's not just for brainy kinds of things. Yeah, okay, so I've already kind of gone over this. I'll just say a word about this dualist interaction business. I mean, back in the time of Descartes, when he first proposed this, that there's some sort of mental world with minds that then ingresses into the physical world through brains and so on. The obvious thing that he got critiqued on was, okay, how does the interaction happen? And if the mental states are non-physical, how could they possibly transfer over into the physical world? And since then, various other people have tried coming up with quantum mechanical kinds of clever ways to avoid conservation of matter violation, of energy violation, and things like that. I don't. Maybe those things are needed, or maybe they add new bells and whistles. But I think long before any of this quantum mechanics stuff, I think we already knew in the classic sort of boring Newtonian universe, because of the importance of mathematical facts, which were not determined by anything in that universe, we already knew that we had this kind of this kind of weird interactionism going on. And so I would just suggest that maybe the way to think about mind-body relations are the way that we think about math and physics relations, which certainly doesn't answer all the questions we have, but I think it reminds us that this isn't some crazy thing that was thought up in the philosophy of mind. I think this is very basic. This mysterious interaction between physical objects and non-physical truths was already there long before that. Um, and of course, there are some interesting clinical data, such as human patients with drastically reduced brain real estate, so brain architecture. And this is a paper where Karina Kaufman and I go over all this stuff, these cases here, that still have normal IQ. And it suggests, it certainly doesn't answer all the questions, but it suggests revisiting this idea that the brain is basically a thin client, it's like a front end interface, and that a lot of the important things are in fact going on in this space of patterns, and that biology and maybe also robotics and other things are just interfaces to certain kinds of patterns. And I think that really reminds us, and this is the part that everybody tends to hate, it's okay if I say that biological creatures get the benefit of this sort of ineffable magic from some other space. That's okay in some circles, but then this part nobody really likes, which is that I think it might actually go all the way down, because even the things that we think of as dumb machines, algorithms, whatever, those are formal models, and the formal models are of the front end. They're not necessarily of the whole system. And I think that's why we're missing something very important about the surprising behaviors that we find in even simple systems. So that's basically it. Just one last thing, and then I'll stop. So there's the summary, the simple claims that I've made, and then there are lots of hypotheses and sort of speculations that we can make, but and we can say, this thing suggests ways to think about free will and things like that. But basically that's it. I don't, most of these claims are, I think, fairly minimal. And then we have a research program. So these are the kinds of things we're doing. We're building new interfaces. We're trying to infer the mapping. We're trying to quantify these free lunch aspects. For example, what do you really get from this Platonic space? Do you get static forms? Do you get dynamic behavior? Do you get algorithms? Do you get virtual machines? Do you get free compute? This is actually something that we're studying. And then lots of other interesting things. And then, of course, the big question of all, which is, where did the contents of that space come from, and could it have been otherwise? I have no idea. Okay, this is where that at this point is way beyond anything I want to speculate on. So that's it. I'll just stop here.
Thank, thank you, Mike. I think that was enough to chew on for a minute. That was wonderful. Something jumped out at me with what you were just saying, that I hadn't fully connected before about this idea. I think I know you said before, forms are the agents and we are the patterns, um, which is a totally new formulation and hard for me to get my head around. And I think you said just now, mind is to body as math is to physics.
Yeah.
Um, so let me try to give a probably wrong understanding of what you said. So are you saying that the individual, like the mind that I think I'm inhabiting over here, the individual is like an antenna, like tapping into a sort of eternal mind or a eternal consciousness, Um, is that the idea, or is it something more direct, like the mind literally is not what I think I am, but something that's ingressing into me?
Well, let me take a step back and say one thing that I think is on fairly strong ground, and then we can talk about the total conjecture, which is the second part. I think we tend to think that we have a rigorous distinction between passive data, so patterns in some excitable medium, and an actual physical agent, a machine that operates on that data. So the machine is the agent, and then the data is like these passive patterns. So Chris Fields and I wrote something much more rigorous around this and dissolving that distinction between thought and thinker. But I'll just give you a kind of a silly science fiction story that gives the flavor of what's going on. So imagine these creatures come out of the core of the earth. Okay, they live down in the core. They're super dense. They use gamma rays for vision. They're like incredibly dense. They come up to the surface. What do they see? Well, they don't see anything because all this stuff that looks solid to us is like a thin plasma to them. They're that dense. They're walking through all this stuff the way that we would walk through a garden of odors and things and not even notice it, right? And one of them is a scientist, and he's taking some measurements. He says, he says to the others, there's a kind of like gas around our planet, and there's patterns in the gas. There are these little eddies in the gas. And like, yeah, well, so what? Well, I've been watching these eddies, and they almost look like they're doing things. Like they almost look like they're agents. They look like they have goal-directed behavior. They hold themselves together for some period of time. And he says, and they say, well, how long? Well, about 100 years back. Yeah. And they say, look, listen, we are real beings. Okay, we are physical beings. Patterns in the gas can't be agents. They're just passive patterns. They come and go. We are actual beings. These patterns are not real. So so we can start with the following. We are also patterns. We are metabolic patterns, for example, in a medium. And so the distinction between and then there's some more subtle things you can do about whether data going through a Turing machine is the boss or whether the machine is the boss and so on. But the first thing to say is that this distinction between patterns and real beings is very much observer dependent. It's in the eye of the beholder. And so that's the first thing, and I think that can be made quite rigorous and strong. But then the other part is, all I'm saying is, if that's true, then maybe the way we should think about this is, instead of viewing this as we are these physical bodies and okay, we have to come to grips with the fact that we are impinged upon by these patterns in that space, maybe we are the actual patterns. And what we mean by, for example, this is, here's a way you can think about it. Maybe what we mean by consciousness is the first person perspective of being a pattern looking out into the physical world through some interface through the body and brain and everything else. So maybe we are the patterns, and so we ultimately live in this space where there are some very kind of simple things that mathematicians study, and then sort of more complex kinds of things, and we are just one of those patterns, and our first person experience is of those patterns embodied through an interface that allows us to project into the physical world. So that's one way to think about it. So that does dovetail with the second thing you raised, which is the sort of antenna theory of the brain, right? And this idea that to some extent it is a front end interface. Now, I'm certainly not saying that the structure of the brain isn't important. It's very critical. The interface, the structure of your interface is very important for what patterns you're going to pick up. But ultimately, it's again this flavor of getting more out than you put in, and I think you see this again and again in biology and math, and I don't see any reason why that couldn't extend to cognitive science.
Cool. That was that was a really interesting answer. So the thing that sort of jars with that for me, or one of the things is, I think of the idea of change as intrinsic to the idea of agency. Like we have cliches like agents for change, and we talk about like novelty, and so part of what we're trying to explain when we're thinking about agents and minds is novelty, like what is individually new that's developed out of the world as it is in a special way. And that's maybe the question that gets to the question of preformationism also. So how does this account for novelty, or is there any novelty? Is there no novelty?
Yeah. Okay. So the first thing to say is that the idea of these forms as being eternal and unchanging, that is not part of my vision. To whatever extent Plato actually thought that, I don't know, but this is something a lot of people have trouble with. That is to say, well, look, the original theory has these forms be these unchanging eternal things. So where's the novelty? Where's the right? Basically exactly what you asked. So I don't think these things are eternal and unchanging. I think there are dynamics going on in that space too, and there's probably there's probably a reason, like what's the point, why would, if you're a pattern in that space, why do you ingress into the physical world at all? What's the point? And I think the point is that through that interaction, something is changing on both ends. In other words, I don't think these are just passive things that are, I mean, maybe, okay, the value of E might be one of these things that just sort of hangs out and doesn't do much over time. But for the kinds of things that we're interested in, which are high agency forms, I think they do change and they learn, and there's new content in that space. I don't see why there wouldn't. I don't see why there wouldn't be.
So does that mean that gets to my next question, and then I have one more and then I'm done. Um so does that mean that even with this theory, even with the Platonic forms thing, we still need an efficient cause and a final cause? Because I think of like, I mean, I think of a bowling ball, right? And I'm trying to explain a bowling ball. The hard plastic is the material cause. The maker of the bowling ball is the efficient cause, the one who made the plastic into that shape. And the reason it's in that shape is because it's to be used for bowling, so it needs to roll really well. And so that all comes together to determine what formal cause it takes on, what form I need to build the bowling ball. Like there's a reason I didn't build it in in a sphere, in a anything other than a sphere. So with this theory, with this Platonic forms theory, do we still need, for a full explanation, do we still need the efficient cause and the final cause to be part of a separate part of the theory? Or do you feel like you're pretty well handling those?
Well, so let's back up. I mean, I'm an engineer and I have an engineering perspective of all this, and in the sense that what we need are things that help us have better interactions with all these things. So to the extent that any of these this terminology of these types of causes is helping us to predict, relate to, discover novel systems, make new systems. The question is, what is useful out of all of that? And so, like one thing, for example, that I think it might be really useful and interesting is a bidirectional feedback between the evolution of the physical interfaces, so the biological structures, and the kinds of forms that can come through. Because if you make a simple interface, like imagine, like, evolution discovers a voltage gated ion channel. Okay, so that's basically a voltage gated current conductance. That's a transistor. And if you have a few of those, you can make logic gates, and then you inherit all this cool stuff about truth tables and NAND as being special, and all the, like, you get all that. You just get all that after you've made this ion channel. So you evolve something, you get handed a bunch of cool competencies from this space that enables that really potentiates evolution. I think there are tons of examples of this where these things make evolution go faster. But what that enables you to do is to create a better interface that's going to pick up higher agency patterns. And so the causation there, right? It's interesting. I don't know what kind of cause that would be called. Okay, I have no idea. But what's important there is to try to understand what are the free lunches, what is the system benefiting from, and if you want to make changes to that system, whether that's regenerative medicine or bioengineering or many other things, you have to ask yourself, what are the control knobs here? What are the what are the actual causes, in the sense of what are the things I as an engineer have to worry about and understand in order to make things happen? So I still think you need to ask those questions. Why did things happen? But the answer to that why is now somewhat different than what we're used to in these fields, I think.
Well, so okay, one last thing. So, but going by what you're saying, I mean, I understand math, like so I understand an explanation. Like in order to know how to interact with a system, I need an explanation of the system, right? And to me, the explanation has like an if-then structure. Like there's hypotheticals, there's like conjectures, you there's false worlds. There's like if it were like this, then this, and if it were like this other thing, then this. But to me, mathematics has this sort of then structure. It's like all a tautology. It's like true by definition, and it's like strict necessity.
Yeah. Right. And I think the things that behave that way are exactly the things we call math. And those are the things, as soon as you get to things that don't behave that way, they say, oh, well, now you're in the, behavioral science, you're into something else now. Right. So yes. So right. So that space seems to be full of things that are well described by these formal models, exactly as you just said. And then it's got a bunch of other stuff that are not very well described by those, which we all know as biologists, when you try to use existing mathematics to describe biology, it often leaves you frustrated. Like some things work, but other things, we don't have the math for this. And I think that's why, because it isn't math anymore, or at least not the way we've been cutting up the disciplines.
Cool. All right. I want to go ahead and call on people. Wayne's had his hand up. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going, Mike?
Hey, Wayne.
See you again. So, yeah, interesting ideas. Yeah, so for me, what I'm seeing here is almost like two different kinds of spaces. So we have these sort of rigid mathematical constants, what we know about the physics of efficient cause. So what we call physical laws right now. These are what you could think of in a certain sense restrictive constraints. They kind of tell us what isn't possible. What things are essentially impossible or nearly impossible without tremendous amount of energy. And then you have these other things, which they're kind of closer to, well, I've kind of said this to you before, the potential space is sort of like when Stuart Kauffman talks about the adjacent possible, or the other guy from biosemiotics talks about the relevant next. Yeah. And these are dynamic spaces. So the space of possibilities is constantly changing, and this is interaction with what has already been actualized. One question I do have when we start to talk about causality is, when you look at your agents like your xenobots or your anthrobots, there's still systems that have to continually make and remake themselves. They're still engaging in metabolism repair. So it's clear why they sort of do, what induces their problem space, right? In a certain sense, because they have to keep alive.
Yeah, but much like the rest of us, they do a lot of stuff that's not.
Yeah, they do some weird stuff that doesn't have to do with that, right? So they're maybe somewhat more sophisticated. But what do you do? So number one, what do you imagine might be the driver for what you might think of as that kind of agency in these purely Platonic spaces, if it isn't some kind of autopoiesis? And when you're addressing it experimentally, how do you make sure that you're not sort of manufacturing an artifact? You know what I mean? Like, how do you ensure that this is real doings in this space that is sort of not actualized? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, well, let me do the first. Let me talk about the first part first. You made a categorical distinction between the two kinds of spaces, and I just want to bring up because I always try to make everything into a continuum. Let me try to give you an in between kind of full form that you can try to decide where it goes. So. And this is based on the work of Patrick Grimm in the 90s, who did something very interesting with logic. So imagine the liar paradox. This sentence is false. So you can say it's a paradox if you insist on one truth value at one time, but you can also add a time axis, and then what you get is an oscillator. It just goes true, false, true, false, true, false, right? Okay, so now what you can do is you can have a group of sentences that mutually refer to each other. So you have a coupled set of equations, and so sentence A might be, I am 50% as true as sentence B, and sentence B says, I am only true when sentence A is less than 70% false, or something like that. So you can build up a small, set of things like that. And when you do, and I have a student who's doing this stuff, so at some point we'll have the paper out. When you have a small system like that, that system can actually do habituation, sensitization, and possibly associative conditioning. In other words, once you have a couple of equations like that, some of them, and so not all, but some such sets of sentences have a dynamical system memory, so that such that when you tweak one of the values repeatedly, you will either get habituation, or you'll get sensitization, or things like that are very clearly like minimal.
Sounds like the fuzzy cognitive maps. You remember that in the 90s? It sounds like the same kind of idea.
It's related, right? But what you've got now is now this is hard to classify according to your initial categorization. Because on the one hand, it's just basic math and logic. On the other hand, well, once you've got the habituation, sensitization, and some of these other things, you're also, like on some chapter of the behaviorist handbook. So you're somewhere else too. So I tend to think this whole thing is a continuum, and we just have different kinds of behaviors, some of which are well described by the kinds of things we do in math, and others start to look like other things. I think our terminology is just not sharp the way we pretend it is. That's the first thing, and then the second thing is, I guess you were asking how. Okay, how do we know that we haven't introduced an artifact? I don't know exactly what artifacts are here. I just know the following. At some point, we need for many things, for regenerative medicine, for bioengineering, for ethics, actually, for many things, we need a good, rigorous science of saying, if I do certain minimal things that have never existed before, which means I don't have a history of selection that I can say, well, obviously this is the environment, so this is, that's going to be green, and then do these things. If we don't have
that selection anyway, that's okay.
Right. Well, yeah. And so if I can't pin it on that, what are going to be the goals and cognitive properties of novel beings? Because we are all going to be living with a wide variety of novel beings soon. We are going to be sharing our world with humans with sensory motor augmentation and substitution, cyborgs, hybrids, you name it, it's all going to be here, every kind of description. How do we relate to beings that are not like us? And that means we need some kind of science of asking, what are the goals of novel systems? Where do they come from? Where do the properties come from? Where do their cognitive competencies come from? Because we're not good at guessing. We guess wildly wrong in both directions all the time. So that's it. So I don't know what's an artifact and what's not. All I know is, when I said, I was going to take some tracheal epithelial cells and plop them in some matrigel, nobody said that, oh yeah, by the way, these things are going to have 4 different types of behaviors, not 12, not 1, but 4, and they're going to have 9,000 new differentially expressed genes, and they're going to de-age, and they're also going to go around and fix neural wounds. Nobody said that, because there's no we have 0 models that would allow you to predict that. So these things come from somewhere, and I'd like to think that it's not random, but that there's some space that we can understand. And so that's it. Maybe it's an artifact and maybe it's not, but still we still have to see these things when they show up, not be surprised and say it's emergence and sort of be done with it.
I want to get to Rupert's question quickly before he has to go to the theater.
Well, thank you, Michael. I agree with almost everything you said. You put it very clearly. There's 2 points I wanted to raise. One is that in the ancient world, there wasn't just Plato, there was Aristotle, and I would think of myself as more an Aristotelian than a Platonist. Aristotle put the causal factors in nature, not transcending nature, and he thought that the formal causes of animals and plants were their souls, and the soul was not a theological concept like it's become today. But the first statement in the whole of Greek philosophy from Thales was the lodestone has a soul. What they thought the magnet had a soul. In other words, their concept of souls was very similar to our idea of fields. And the shaping soul of organisms was very similar to what we now call the morphogenetic field. And I know you use this concept a lot. So one of the disputes I've had for many years with holistically minded biologists, most notably Brian Goodwin, who was a good friend of mine, but who was also a Platonist. I mean, I've been thinking about these things for a very long time, and Brian Goodwin basically thought that the field wasn't really an actual field, something that's actually there. It was just a placeholding name for a complex of things that were determined by Platonic type maths. On the other hand, we know there are actual fields that are really there, like magnetic fields and gravitational fields. So I myself think the morphogenetic field is a real field with new properties that aren't just those of known physical systems and known mathematics. And as you know, I think that one of those properties is to have a memory from previous systems through morphic resonance. In other words, that time is built in, evolution is radically important in the whole of this, because what happens now depends on what's happened before, not just on what's going on in a transcendent, timeless realm. But that's why I was particularly interested when you said that your conception of Platonism is a kind of evolutionary Platonism rather than the static Platonism we're so familiar with. In which case, if it's evolutionary, then the forms, the structures, the behavioral patterns and so forth will actually evolve according to what's actually happened in the real world. And it seems to me that this would then start making predictions very similar to morphic resonance. If lots of animals learn a new trick in one place, similar animals somewhere else should learn it quicker, because in your language, the Platonic behavioral patterns have been modified by this memory. In my language, they've been changed by morphic resonance. So I wonder how you think of that, because it seems to me a bit ambiguous at the moment, your idea of fields and also of the evolution of these forms.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, we agree on a lot. I guess let's focus on two things. One is, in many ways, I think what you say about the physicality of the fields is right, but some of the properties they have would really stretch the notion of physics. I mean, you can just define physics and say physics is the study of everything there is. Well, okay, and then you can sort of accommodate anything and everything. But at some point, what I see is, you know, you have whatever outcomes you're looking for, let's say anatomy and whatever, and then you sort of go upstream of that and you say, okay, yes, there's a field with certain properties that determines that. And you say, yeah, but why does it have those properties? And part of the answer to that is going to be, oh, because Feigenbaum's constant is this and not that. And at that point, it seems to me, to any reasonable definition of physics, you've left physics. You're somewhere else. You could say, well, no, that's physical too. I'm just not sure what that buys is, but I also think that putting labels on putting labels of what area of science are we in on things, I don't think is particularly useful. So I think all of these things are real in the sense that if I as an engineer have to worry about it, then it's real. So I'm much more interested in whether it's real and what's my interface for manipulating it, than whether it belongs to physics or metaphysics or whatever else. And then the second thing is about the evolutionary aspect. I understand your point about what happens to existing patterns as time goes on. Okay, I fully get that, and I suspect that there may be in addition to this sort of sensitization effect that you described, that with time it's easier and easier to do things. There may be other interesting effects like that actually more resemble habituation or anticipation or various other things. I'm totally open to all of that. But I'm also interested in things that have never been here before, and being able to at some point be able to say, if I make this new kind of interface that's never been here before, what are the patterns that this thing is going to pick up and why? And I think that's really important for us in bioengineering, but it's important in AI, and it's important in other, other aspects where we can't just lean on, oh, it's because this has happened so many times before, now it's going to happen faster. Like that's great, but there are going to be other components that have never happened before, and yet, or maybe aspects of it have happened before, but never in this configuration or something. So I want a mature science of being able to do more than be surprised by these things when they show up and say that, well, they're emergent, and and how cool. Like that's all. There's novelty here that we need to be able to predict and relate to.
Well, I agree with that, but I think the place where we can actually see this in action is in chemistry. Organic chemistry are constantly synthesizing compounds that have never been here before, and then they're crystallizing and producing crystal lattice structures that have never been here before. And to some degree, they can model what's going to happen. You know, if you put a methyl group on here, or you tack on a benzene ring here, you can predict to some extent, based on general rules of thumb and expectations, what's going to happen. But you can't predict it exactly. And when you read something like Sasha Shogin's book, Pikal, where he talks about how he made all these different psychoactive phenethylamine derivatives, he can make a vague prediction as to the physical properties, but no prediction at all as to what mental effect it would have when he ingested them. That's purely empirical. A lot of science is purely empirical, but you do have rough guidelines in chemistry and in crystallography and in protein folding. I mean, Google DeepMind can, to some degree, predict the structure of proteins based on their primary structure, but that's not because it's understanding deep principles. It's just because it's got a huge database of lots of similar things. So it doesn't work on first principles methods. So I think that actually there are many areas where it is actually possible to say something about things that haven't been here before, but they'd still, I think, be subject to morphic resonance and sensitization or habituation or whatever.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. There are many things where, and I think this is where most of the successes of science have come from, is those places where things are linear enough that you can say, what's going to happen. But what I'm interested in also is the following. Again, I don't think we disagree on any of this stuff. I think it's the fact that it isn't just when you put together certain kinds of systems, it isn't just complexity that appears, or unpredictability, or novelty, or anything like that. What often appears are degrees of things that are recognizable to behavioral scientists. In other words, what you get are behavioral competencies of different levels of sophistication, aka kinds of minds. And I think that's profound, right? Is the idea that you don't just get the kinds of things that you would expect. Like complexity is easy to get. We have cellular automata and things will make complexity and unpredictability all day long. But very often you get things where it's like, hey, that's delayed gratification, or that's the kinds of things that we're used to thinking about when we think about real agency. And that I think is the coolest part of this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rupert. Good to see you.
I'm going to have to vanish at this point, so sorry not to be able to continue with you all. Hopefully another time. Right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Great. Kate, you've got your hand up.
Well, I was hoping that Rupert would stay a minute longer, because my question was I have a couple of questions for Mike, of course, but what he was, I'm going to need to go back and study his morphic resonance a little bit more, because I've been talking about the emotional sense as resonance in a story that is interactional between two domains. And Mike, I want to say thank you so much for your work. It's really changed everything for someone who's been trying to talk about this stuff for a long time. So thank you. The question I was going to ask Rupert, Mike, that I'll now ask you, in terms of the pattern of us in being ingressed upon in the context of quantum decoherence. There's a lovely new book out by Wojtek Zurek called Quantum Darwinism. And he offers what I think is a really important piece about how there can be records hanging around in the environment. He talks about the environment as both a witness and a record. And his is the most clear description that I've heard of, a piece of a physical story that allows for information to hang around in the external environment. And I was wondering if you have thought about that much. I know you don't spend a lot of time talking about quantum mechanics, but I think that there are deep implications for what you're saying that can come from there. And this is one of them.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, the reason I don't mostly talk about it is I don't have any expertise in it. I don't like to, sort of talk about things where I don't really know what I'm talking about. And so I couldn't comment on that in any deep way, except to say that there are other. So for example, I came across, and again, this is something I should ask Julian Howe or somebody who knows these things. But there's also this notion of gravity scars. So apparently, right? So apparently. Bent space-time, and the mass has been here and now it's gone, but it left some, like, I don't, this is way beyond anything that I understand, but again, I think there are things in physics that are deeply relevant to these sorts of things, and at what point are they still called physics versus something else? I don't want to lose any sleep over that, but I think we should just be really ready to port concepts across disciplines when needed, because at some point. But the other thing is I'm pleased to some extent by the fact that I think the fundamental problem with physicalism shows up long before you need to know anything about quantum anything. Like certainly some cool new things happen in quantum physics. Okay, no doubt, and maybe they're important for all the things, but even in the classic sort of deterministic boring universe, a lot of these interesting things are already there. Right, so they're like it's already there. So I think we can do quite a bit of work even without, which is why I haven't tried to sort of become better versed on this stuff. Plenty of other people think about this. So.
Well, that's wonderful. You just keep doing what you're doing, because it's a lot easier for those of us that are willing to speculate wildly based on your work. So thank you so much. Can I have just a couple quick more? I'm shifting back to specifically how I'm asking you, let's see, is there a distinction in your mind between cognitive psychology and neuroscience or behavioral science? Is there any distinction there?
Sorry, 1 second. Turn this off. No, I think neuroscience isn't really about neurons at all. I think neuroscience is about cognitive glue, and it's about mechanisms that allow scaling up of systems and cognitive light cones towards goals and spaces that their parts don't have. Now, neurons are awesome at that, clearly, no doubt, but there are many other systems that do it all the way down below the level of single cells and probably abiotic things as well. And so I think it's all fundamentally behavioral science, different kinds of it. But of course, neural kinds of systems have some really neat tricks up their sleeve, and so that's why a lot of people focus on them. But I don't think it's about. I don't think this is about neurons at all.
Sorry, I just got interrupted by a phone call. So can I just make a quick comment that the whole cognitive neuroscience project sort of forgot about what was going on in behaviorism, which was the old tradition in psychology before the cognitive revolution. And the distinction to me is the fact that the mind was a black box, and all they looked at was stimulus and response. And all of the capabilities, the intelligences that you're talking about, from sensitization, well, the whole gamut of them, up to conditioned learning, was all that. It was all stimulus and response, environmental stimulus, behavioral response. And I think that that's one thing that needs to be emphasized in the computational approaches, is that what is the difference between the physiological stimulus and response of animals versus the algorithmic machinery that is all about prediction? Because the little perception action loop that's talked about in the Friston model and all of that, you have an error signal, and then you have the reduction of surprise as the response, if you will, that changes the model somewhat. And that's how you get to build a model with feed forward steps. But what's missing from that is the stimulus response. And it's not just one model compared to another, it's environmental stimulus and a behavioral response of an organism. So in my work, the error signal is actually a valence, and it's the feeling is literally a response to physical stimulus, and the behavior, moving, approach, or avoidance is the response. And it's only because of that coupled feeling and action urge in the qualia that you get that memory in the first place. That's Pavlovian conditioning, and it's based on the stimulus response. So I guess my question to you is, are there any experiments that you can do that can distinguish between the need for a valence signal versus simply a surprise signal in the work that you're doing?
Well, I mean, I think valence goes all the way down. I don't think these are mutually incompatible things. I think that, you know, if to really kind of push it in that direction, I think geometric frustration is real frustration, you know, and I think all of these things are can be profitably you know, identified and thought about in very minimal kinds of things. So I think, yeah, I think all of this goes together. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Happy to hear that.
Awesome. Richard.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks, Mike. I think I'm just going to reflect back something you already said and already understand to see if I understand it. I don't think I'm saying anything you didn't already say. I was struck by Charlie's comment about maths doesn't feel like it has an if-then structure. It feels like it's just a timeless form. And your in-between example that you gave Wayne, Mike, about Patrick Grimm's liar paradox, and I noticed that there's something there that mathematical forms appear to be timeless. So they're not cause and effect structures. It's just a relation. Patrick Grimm's stuff looks like it's paradoxical because you can't tell what its form is in a timeless way. But you can see what its form is now, that A is causing B, or that it's true now. And then at a moment later, it has a different form. Oh, B is causing A. It's like it's false now. And so then you see that if you can step back from it and see it as a 2 points of time cycle, instead of trying to find a truth which is eternal, which is timeless, if you can see it as a 2 points in time repeating, then you can say, oh, it's not paradoxical now. And also, it's like a slightly temporally extended thing. And whilst you see it in that truth stroke time axis, it becomes a timeless pattern again. It becomes the fractal that Patrick Grimm is drawing. They're timeless things, right? Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3, what if we had cognitive things that don't look like they're eternal forms at all. They look like they're temporarily extended things which are learning, evolving, changing over time, responding to their environments, changing into something new. What if what they are is higher dimensional timeless forms that we are not able to stand back from enough to see them as timeless forms? So instead, we're just chasing them around and they look like they keep changing. Like if you're not able to do the stepping back that is required that Patrick Grimm did, then his looks like it's always changing. It's like, oh, now it's A and now it's B and now it's A and now it's B, now it's true, now it's false. But a cognitive system looks like it's continually changing over time because we're not able to stand back from it in a high dimensional enough way to see it as a timeless form, which doesn't have any cause and effect there, so that it's just a pattern. Am I on the same wavelength?
Yes, in two ways, and I preface this by saying that I in no way feel like I've cracked the role of time in this whole thing. So like this is who knows, but one thing is I had my graphic artist Jeremy Gay. I asked them to draw this thing, which is, I mean, I guess I don't have it with me, so you guys can visualize it. So imagine it's a dining room, and there are these five-dimensional aliens, and are having dinner, and they have a rug underneath, and the rug looks like the block four-dimensional universe that you always see the physicists draw, right? It's a static four-dimensional thing where time is just, and so there it is. And so to them it's an oriental rug. It's a static pattern. It isn't going anywhere. Nobody's doing anything. There aren't any actions. There isn't anything happening. There are spatial patterns, regularities, like symmetries in a rug, like you see certain things. And then there's a baby, and he's crawling around on the rug, and he's got this little thing that's like a little slit, and he's sort of slowly pushing it up the rug, and it's like a flip book, like we all had when we were kids. You flip and you go, look, the little man is moving around. And so when the kid is doing it, he says, wow, it's like this, it's like a whole world. It's like, look, there's a set of people down there, and they're doing things. But of course, from everybody else looks down, they see a rug, right? So that's, yes, again, I think in the eye of the beholder. And the other thing that's important here, I think, is frame rate. And I think maybe this is what Parande was just saying. When you have that true false oscillator, what's the frequency of that oscillator, right? How fast does it oscillate? Well, as fast as you as a cognitive system want to evaluate the function. And multiple observers are going to see multiple things. And so yeah, I think what you're pointing out is very right, that the sort of mental frame rate, the dimensionality of observation, all of this of observers are going to see different things. And if you want to, and I think this is also true in science, that if somebody wants to have a perspective that misses all of this stuff entirely, no problem. There is a bottom-up reductionist kind of approach. If you want to not see any of this, easy enough, and you can do that, and you will not see any of it. But the question is, are there other perspectives where you do get to see it?
Yeah, and I was just expanding a little in my mind as I was thinking about what you were saying, that in between Patrick Grimm's slightly temporally extended eternal pattern and cognitive systems which appear like they're learning and evolving over time but not following a timeless form, there are things which for a while they look like we would say, I thought it was learning something. I thought it was alive for a moment, but now that I am able to stand back from it enough, I see that it's just a machine. I see that it's just a cause and effect, that it's going around this loop over and over again, that there isn't any opportunity for it to do anything different this time than it did last time. So it's a higher dimensional pattern. What we mean by saying it's just a machine is that we've recognized what the higher dimensional pattern is, that it's following around. Whereas when we are not able to do that, we're continually chasing it because it's at the edge of what we are able to perceive as in the dimensionality with which we're working, then that looks like something which is continually changing, and we say that it's agential rather than it's machine-like.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although it seems to me that you can, it kind of goes in both directions in the following way. So I think the IQ, so to speak, of the observer massively determines how you're going to see the system. But in the other direction, you can easily miss the agential part by not being smart enough. So I try to remind myself and our students that it's all of this stuff is a two-way IQ test. And if you don't know what to look for, and if you don't know, if you're not creative enough to hypothesize goals and spaces that the system might be using that you can't see, you will also say, well, this is just a machine, and some combination of algorithm and randomness is going to do the trick, and that's all there is to it. And,
Yeah.
and look, I have a brand new paperweight for you, and somebody else says that is a brain, and you say, nah, it's a paperweight. And right, and so I think, right, it's very easy to miss this stuff, which means that, you know, maybe there are some sort of impedance matches between the observer and the system that enable you to see certain things. And maybe it's, you know, goes in bands or something, and maybe it's also fractal, like who knows.
Yeah. Cool. I'm with you.
Mike, can I ask a question about that? I have, so like all through your work, like like you've probably done more than anyone else to extend people's horizon of downward in the tree of life towards simpler organisms, as far as people attributing agency and intelligence to simpler and simpler forms. And that's like just a general trend, you know, of the modern era. You know, it seems like the bar always gets lower and lower as we look closer. Um, but I have a problem or I have a stumbling block with how you describe it, because you talk a lot about cognitive competencies. And so to me, cognition and agency is something, it's about building a worldview, an explanation of the world. And so necessarily that's an interaction with physical reality that's a unique interaction for that individual organism to some degree. And it results in some sort of causal structure. And so there's an explanation of the world in in your mind, or in an organism's mind, that's different. But the competency part, so the tests that you have for intelligence, the competencies, those are tests in our domain. Like they're tests in our world, right? And so it doesn't test for another world being there. Like it intrinsically, and so I feel like that's part of your like panpsychism thing is like we don't know how smart it is until we play with it. It's a two-way IQ test. But it, to me, I feel like it's missing the key component of like, is there something looking back at me?
Yeah. Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And so there's a couple of ingredients here. I agree with you, but there are two ingredients to think about. First is, remember that my job mostly is to sell this stuff to people who don't think there are minds maybe anywhere, or certainly not outside of brains. So like I try, you know, for dealing with bioengineers, molecular cell biologists, and that kind of a thing, I have to stick to publicly observable, third person verifiable, pragmatically useful outcomes. So, you know, I have to stick to, and so this is why I try to be, so minimal about this, is that I need to be able to say, look here, you get more discoveries from bringing in this behavioral test than otherwise you would have, and that's just, we can all see that that's true, and so there's nothing more to argue about. The kind of thing that you're bringing up is closely related to the problem of other minds. I would get zero traction talking about that, because we can't, you know, there are limitations here, and I don't know if they're surmountable at some point. But however, I agree with you that that's important for us all to think about. And I think about it in the following way. I do try to sneak that in certain ways, and I do it as follows. Imagine so you have some kind of a bumpy landscape, and you've got a billiard ball on that landscape. All that you need to know about what's going to happen is your external perspective on the landscape, and that tells the whole story. If you've got a mouse on that landscape, your view of the landscape is kind of useless. What you need is the mouse's view of the landscape, and where he's been rewarded and punished, and what he's paying attention to, and all this stuff, right? So the way I do is so the way I do put this into the conversation is to say, there are certain behavior tests that are fine from a purely external third person perspective, but I wonder if we can do better if we take the systems perspective and ask ourselves, what does the world look like from the perspective of a gene regulatory network, a bunch of cells becoming an anthrobot, and so you can start to do this, and I think it's very important to do it, but it doesn't quite, it's not, I don't have any magic that is going to help us across the problem of other minds. And so if someone wanted to say, fine, it has an inner perspective that's really important for understanding the system, and yet no one's home ever anywhere, including my own brain, which I've had people say to me, imagine that, and there's all it is all there is forming models of the outside world from a certain perspective of being that system. That's all there is. If somebody wants to hold that view, I don't have anything that will sort of dispel that. But I completely agree with you that taking the perspective of these systems is actually really important. And I will further say that taking that seriously, you have to be, if you really take it seriously, you have to be willing to do it to all kinds of unconventional things. So you should be able to, you should be willing to ask yourself, what is it like to be the number 3, and what is it like to be what is the first person perspective of a fractal and of E and of the amplituhedron and God knows what else is there. Like, these are all, they become, if you're willing to do that for a cell or for a gene regulatory network, you have to at least consider doing that for some very wildly different systems. And so most people draw lines somewhere, and sometimes that's brains, and sometimes that's cells, and sometimes that's whatever, but you could ask that about anything. And sometimes you get interesting answers. And there's a couple of people in particular in our symposium that are doing that for mathematical objects. And they sort of chided me for saying, hey, you're calling these mathematical objects low agency. How can you do that until you've tested them in their own environment? And I said, you got me. You're absolutely right. I don't know. And we have to do the experiments, and there's actually people working on that.
Cool. Kate?
Oh, can you ask Robert first? Because I think my question's going to tether onto his real well.
Sure. Robert, go for it. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself first. There you go. Oh. Still don't have your audio, Robert. I still don't have your audio for some reason. I don't know why. You're not muted, but I can't read your audio. I don't know. You're unmuted, but your audio is gone. Do you want to type your question in?
By the way, I've put the link to the Platonic Space Symposium on the chat. It's asynchronous, so it's going on all fall, and so you can see all the talks that have been given. And at some point there will be a real-time discussion. But for now, there's just talks, and there's a long discussion, like a written commentary on it.
Very cool.
Link to it in the invitation email too, so that should be there.
Yeah, so everybody's welcome to attend.
Great. Robert, we still don't have your audio for some reason.
Okay, then I will jump in with mine. Hopefully you can fix that. But I suspected that Robert might want to be picking up on the concept of fractals, because Mike, I'm a Platonist like you, as well as an Aristotelian in terms of the dynamism. But the idea of a fractal structure jibes with the idea that there's some sort of level independent kind of antenna going on. And I'm wondering what you might be able to tell us from any speculations about what the fractal structure means in terms of boundaries, because living forms have a boundary, they have a structure, right? But, well, forms, let's just say Platonic forms have a structure. They're bounded. But living forms also have a structure that's being preserved through the bioelectric patterning and all that, but that they're also open to the environment thermodynamically, and you're constantly exchanging energy. So the question of the boundary, where does the form stop and the environment begins, gets at this idea of the light cone as an interface in between and any kind of field, physical field that might be there, offering morphic resonance. So as a Platonist, how do you see the significance of fractal mechanics in additionally like the Mandelbrot, because they're iterative equations, and something is coming out anew each time, and I think that's really central to the process here.
Yeah, yeah, very, very deep question. I can say two things, which neither are satisfactory, but this is what I can say. First of all, I think what's interesting is that counter to certain models like IIT and so on, which suggest that there's one sort of one level, the highest level of information integration is the agent, everything else is sort of mindless. Counter to those kinds of ideas, I think that forms love to cohabit at different scales. So this is very fractal. So in a, let's say in a mammalian body, you might have one very large one, so to speak, that is the mammalian mind that's sitting there, but you've also got a ton of others that live in the tissues and the organs and the cells and the gene regulatory network space and the physiological space and the metabolic space, and there's just it's just an incredible layering at every scale. You're going to find these things of diverse competencies. So none of them are zero. So even the gene regulatory networks can do certain things, and they're navigating that space, and the bioelectric networks certainly do various things. And they're all sort of hanging out together, having reciprocal causal interactions on each other. So I think the interface to these patterns is itself fractal, in the sense that you're picking up patterns of different sophistication, and they all kind of can coexist in the same interface. That's the first thing. And the other thing that I can just briefly mention, I don't like to say too much until stuff is peer reviewed, but we have there will be some things coming in the next couple of months around using mathematical objects such as fractals and giving them a body, embodying them. So typically the things that have bodies are things that are like biological agents or maybe robotic controllers or things like that. But what happens when you give a mathematical structure a body? And we've done this, and the results are super interesting, which is by the way still not the same thing. And I forget who mentioned it about, or maybe Charlie said about testing these things in their own world. So that's still not the same thing, because and I'm leaving that to the mathematicians to do that. I can't do it. But aside from what they can do in their own space, we can give them an embodiment in our space, and it's pretty wild. So that's something else, and we'll find out whether fractals do anything different than other mathematical objects. So stay tuned for that. But for sure it's interesting.
Awesome. Just one final comment. I loved your sketch of a proof, and the idea that you start with set theory and you get the specific value of E. Now, doesn't that have to do with logarithms? Because to me, I see that as the meeting place between the forms that are part of the machinery that aren't going to change. Like you always have pi, and you said that this specific value of E is just a fact there in the Platonic realm, but also too, that's sort of the flip side of the fractal being part of the organism, in that that takes you mathematically to the whole domain of criticality and power laws and self similarity at every scale, which is where I see your concept of the cognitive light cone or the Markov blanket playing out, but that there is a subjective relativity to it, kind of like Dennis Noble's biological relativity, where you have a whole in its an external environment. So you have that dance of parts and wholes, but that you have the bottom up and top down kind of organizational closure between parts and wholes at every level. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, just to say that I try to choose these examples very carefully to be very minimal in the following. Like I started out originally, I would say pi, and then people would say, but pi is about circles, and circles in different kinds of you can have space with negative curvature. Pi, so pi isn't really fine. Let's forget pi. I don't want things that look like they're actually determined by. I mean, pi is not actually about the circles anyway, but I don't want examples that look like they're sort of, and I agree with you, of course, these things are very interlinked, right? The reality is very interlinked, but I want something very pure and simple and like difficult to kind of smudge over. And so things like E or Feigenbaum's constant, and again, the mathematicians may tell me that that's not a great, that there's better examples, and that'd be great. But for now, I want things where people really feel like, yeah, there's not anything I could tweak in the physical universe to make this be different. It's just it comes from a different space. That I think is important. So while I agree with you, all of these things are very tied into both physics and biology. I try for an example that is as clear as possible.
We appreciate that, especially you standing out there on the front line, taking all of the bullets and having your courageous balance between really unflinching good science and where it's taking you philosophically. So thanks. I just think what you're doing is really important.
Thanks, Kate. I appreciate it a lot.
Josh?
Hi, Mike. Thank you for your presentation. I'm going to take a risk of asking maybe just a really dumb question, and once I state it, then I'll elucidate it a little bit and hopefully make it a little less dumb. And the question is basically just, so if there's this Platonic space where these minds might operate, where is it? And what I mean by that, hopefully to get myself out of the stupidness of that question, you gave this great analogy at the beginning about these sort of subterranean creatures that are so dense and operate at such a more dense level that gamma rays are their vision and so forth. But I take it in that analogy that the vision that we use to look into this Platonic space would be not vision, but it would be our interactions with various tools or machines or objects that elucidate for us these patterns that we otherwise don't see. And so, right, so that would be sort of the analogous measurement vehicle by which we interact with the space or try to understand it. And if that's right, I guess, I haven't been able to follow, and I've been trying to listen. I've listened to a lot of your talks and read a lot of your stuff. And I haven't been able to follow why we're making the jump from the mathematical realm to the physical realm in terms of the discovery of these patterns. And I would like it if you would say a little bit more about why. Now, you've said so far that there's these free lunches, right? So if you look at mathematical situation, you could see, okay, you have I don't know, even something as simple as just like the prime numbers and the ability to create indecipherable cryptographic means, right, through just like it's kind of a free lunch just from a counting system, just from number theory, right? So I haven't been able to follow exactly why things that some people describe as emergent, or things that we just say, well, we don't understand where that comes from, why that pushes you in particular to think that those things would exist in a Platonic space in the same way as those mathematical things. And it's kind of like the obvious question of the whole thing. So maybe I'm missing something, but I wish you would say a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Let me first just talk about the first thing you said, which was quite interesting. How do we interact? How do we see these patterns? So I'll just remind us that on my theory, we are the patterns. So when you as a pattern have two choices, two sort of routes for how you're going to interact with other patterns. You could go through the physical interface and say that I'm looking outward into physical space. I do some experiments, I make some inferences, and then I find things that look to me like patterns. That's one. Or you could do what Darwin said. Darwin said that mathematicians have a different sense than the rest of us. He was pointing out that those of us who are good at math are able to interact with some of those patterns directly. Why? Because we are patterns ourselves, and most of us have to look out. I'm terrible at math, and so I have to look out and do experiments, and I say, "Wow, look, we found this or that." But some people say, "Oh man, yeah, the SU2 symmetry. Oh yeah, well of course, eightfold or whatever the heck it is." And they can sort of, they don't have to do experiments to do it. They can get there, and maybe it's obvious, or maybe they have to sit there and sort of think about it, or whatever, right? But I just want to put that in, because things look different. The conventional, if there is a conventional view here, the conventional view would be that we are fundamentally physical beings who then occasionally get a glimpse of these patterns, these weird patterns. But I'm sort of flipping that. I'm saying we are the patterns. And yes, you can take because we're so used to it, you can take the route of going through the physical world, or maybe you can interact with them yourself. And moreover, this business of erasing the distinctions between thoughts and thinkers means that you as a pattern, as a cognitive pattern within that space, are constantly firing off the way that I don't know, hurricanes generate little tiny hurricanes, right? You are also generating other things, and they might be fleeting thoughts, which are sort of patterns that sort of come and then eventually dissipate, or you might have some persistent, intrusive, depressive, whatever thoughts that kind of hang around for a while and are pretty difficult to get rid of. And maybe they even do a little niche construction in your brain to try to keep themselves around. And maybe somebody has a dissociative identity disorder, where there are literally fragments that have goals and plans and do things to really hang around and so on. So I just wanted to say that we need, I think we need to consider the possibility of seeing it from that perspective. And now the second part, why is it a space? Well, look, first of all, a few things. First of all, what I'm understanding from the neuroscientists, and also from people like Don Hoffman and so on, is that this stuff is just as constructed as everything else. Like, I don't know why we've decided that this is the real space, and then all these other things are sort of metaphorical spaces. I mean, 3D space seems to me to be, we as creatures that heavily rely on our vision that goes in straight lines and various other things, have a kind of obsession with 3D space. And to me, these other spaces are no less real, and functionally just as important. But the only way to avoid saying that these other things are in a space is to say they have no metric structure to them. In other words, it's just a random bag of what people call regularities or pattern, things that just hold in our world. So there's the value of E, and the way that certain networks can do associative conditioning, and the way that logic gates work when you make the transistors and all this stuff. That's just how it is. There's no structure to them. We're not going to call them a space. I mean, all I'm saying by calling it a space is to say that there's an order to it, such that once you've touched one of them, you are now better primed to touch others that are connected. And that could be through experiment, or that might be through direct introspection, or whatever. But there's a latent space from which these things are drawn. They're not random, and that's 100% a metaphysical assumption. I can't prove it. There's no way for me to say that that's how it is. I'm just saying that if you want a research program, I think you're better off assuming that it's a structured space, rather than just like surprises that we hit on from time to time.
Yeah, I guess my only follow-up would just be to say, well, is there a particular reason why we wouldn't look for the generation of that that space that would have that geometry, or that some ability to navigate through that space of ideas? Why we wouldn't look for the the generation of that in the physical?
Well, only because, and again, I'm prepared if some mathematician is going to tell me I'm wrong, I'm prepared to change my mind on this. But as far as I can tell, if you wanted E to have a different value, there is nothing you can do in the physical world to make that happen. You could imagine having your hand on all of the knobs. So there's whatever, half a dozen unitless constants in physics that define at the beginning of the Big Bang, they sort of define everything that's going to happen later. As far as I understand, could be wrong. As far as I understand, you could tweak those things all you want. You are never going to change the value of E. There is nothing in the physical world or Feigenbaum's constant or any of these other, phi or any of these other things. You cannot do anything. And so to me, it's the functional, I'm interested in the functional notion of causality. It's like, what can I tweak to make a change in a certain system? And if there's nothing you can tweak in the physical world to change that number, then to me, it doesn't come from the physical world. You can try to expand physics and you can say, you know what, physics is also all this other stuff, in which case, okay, but what have what have we done now? Now we've just basically taken away whatever meaning physics had in terms of, here are the tools we use. We use colliders and rulers and voltmeters. Like by adding math to that, I don't, I'm not sure you've done anything useful.
Thanks. Thank you.
Dina, you have your physical hand is raised.
Yes, my physical hand. Old school. I have I'm competing for a dumb question. I think I'll win. So I have two. One is just about the word pattern. I want to know what makes something a pattern. Is it that it repeats? Does it mean that it's predictive?
Yeah.
Does it mean that it's defined by principles or relationships? When you say pattern, can you just define that? And then I have a follow-up.
Yeah, no, that is a very profound question. So as best as I can tell, a pattern is something that and I realize it's circular, and I think that's a good feature of it, as much as we're not used to it. I think patterns are things that are readily recognizable by observers. But I've already told you that observers are also patterns, so it is kind of circular. But patterns are states that other agents and other observers find recognizable, tractable, beautiful, all of those things.
So non-stochastic, doesn't have to repeat, but it's got some order to it. It's got like that will signal out of the noise type thing.
Yeah, I mean, you've just raised another issue which I've never considered before, which is whether there's some kind of really bizarre agent that finds actual noise to be a pattern. I don't know. I have to think about that. But
Okay.
but maybe there's some kind of really bizarre agent that would do that. But yeah, it's some kind of regularity. You can say compressible. I don't love it for other reasons, but you can say that it's something that's compressible to be, or generalizable, or rememberable, or detectable to an active agent.
Okay, so but it's all, again, it's a relativistic definition.
Yes and no. So it is with one, it is relative to another observer. So in that sense, it sort of dovetails, like like Dennett would have said, oh, you mean the intentional stance, right? It's whatever other observers see. With one proviso, I don't think that significant agents don't require other agents to reify them by noticing them, because they notice themselves. In other words, I suspect that significant agents can lock themselves in by being observers of themselves. It doesn't mean, what I'm not saying is that you're not real unless somebody's there to observe you as a pattern. I'm saying that if you're a significant agent, you are observing yourself, and that's
You're back to Descartes.
That's it.
And then my other small question really goes back to Charlie's third question, which is when he asked you about the four causes. And I guess when he asked you that question, I was expecting you to just say, having tried to understand your work, is that the four causes are just one cause, and that is the pattern. like there's no separateness from the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the final cause, that it all points right back to the Platonic space.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think trying to what you're doing in separating those causes is you're picking a particular observational vantage point. You're picking a perspective of scale how much IQ do you see in that process tells you what kind of cause you think it is. If you think it's a if you're picking a low level perspective where the agency is minimal, then you see one kind of cause. If you're backing out into a much larger view where some more agency is visible, then you say, somebody intended to build this thing, and so on. It's all you're doing is picking a perspective of some observer, and then that's what you get to see. Yeah,
thank you.
I think that's fair.
Looks like Kate's got her hand up, but Henry also be waving to us. Is that the case, Henry?
Yes, I have put so many times for the with question, but my computer always turn them off. So
it turned it into clapping. Clapping.
So always, yeah.
I thought you were clapping for me, Henry, all this time.
I thought you were thinking of everyone's comment.
But I am clapping. But anyway, so I have just very simple question. One is, Michael, do you think the pattern, there is a trend to increase the complexity?
Yeah, that's a great question, and believe it or not, I think we now have some insight into this. Well, why is difficult? I can give you a little bit of a how. Okay, why is always a hard thing to deal with. I can tell you that, and this is a paper that just came out, and the new one that's going to be pre-printed in, I don't know, a few weeks. We found something really interesting. Imagine a chemical reaction that is described by a small set of ordinary differential equations. Okay. We found several years back that such coupled sets of chemical reactions are capable of simple forms of learning, six different kinds of learning. Okay. What we found more recently, this is Federico Pagosi's work that was just published, is that let me take a step back. Why we did this? If you imagine you take a rat and you train it to press a lever, it gets a reward. Okay. There's no single cell inside that rat that had both experiences. The cells at the bottom of the feet pressed the lever, the cells in the gut got the sugar. No individual cell had both experiences. Who owns the associative conditioning between those two things? Well, the rat. So what that means is, if you're going to have associative learning between diverse components, you have to have a degree of integration. And there's mathematics around this from the causal information theory of Hole and Tononi and other people that allow you to measure such things. And so what I asked Federico to do was to look in the opposite direction. We know that you have to have certain degree of integration to learn, but what happens to your level of integration when you learn? In other words, does the process of learning have any implications for your existence as a system that's more than the sum of its parts? How does learning affect causal integration in systems? And so we looked at it in these gene regulatory networks, and what he found was that when you train these networks, their causal emergence goes up, and we measure it with a metric called phi d. So when they learn, phi d goes up. Okay, but so that's published. Now here's the new stuff that is about to come out. Two other interesting things. One is, if you force them to forget what they've learned, which we are studying for medical reasons, because many of your body networks, you would like them to forget certain things. So we're studying ways to make these networks forget. When you force it to forget, whatever gains of phi d they had made, you don't lose them. So you learn things and your integration goes up, so you become more of an integrated agent. But if you forget those things, you don't drop back down. And the final piece of it is that when your phi d goes up, you get better at learning. So if you put those things together, you get this crazy ratchet. It's an asymmetric unidirectional ratchet that says that when I get stimuli and I learn, my phi d goes up. When my phi d goes up, I get better at learning. If I happen to forget something, I don't lose my gains. And so you get this ratchet that, and notice something else that's interesting. That dynamic happens before you get replication, before you get selection, before there's no, this is long before evolution kicks in. There are no replicators here. This is not about a differential reproduction or anything like that. Long before proper evolution kicks in, there is an asymmetric ratchet for agency. It aims upwards for learning and for integration. And so I can tell you how there is at the basis of evolution, there appears to be an asymmetric ratchet driving up towards not just complexity, but actual intelligence and integrated agency. But if you want to know why, well, it's a free gift from mathematics, like every other free lunch that we've been talking about, because there is no biology here, there is no physics here, there is no selection here. I haven't told you any. This does not rely on any specific mechanism in physics. It doesn't rely on any selection of biological substrates competing for resources or any of that. Those kind of stories. It is purely a novel property that hadn't been known before of the way that phi works and the way that learning works in networks. It comes from the mathematics of networks and the mathematics of causal emergence, and so it's a free gift. And then I think the biologic, the prebiotic, and so the next paper. So we've got one coming out, and the one after that is going to be looking at actual origin of life chemistries to see this stuff play out. But there you go. Again, I blame all of this on a free lunch from the Platonic space, and if you want to know why it works, the only explanation is going to be because that's how the mathematics of networks and of causal emergence works.
Sure. So the follow-up question is actually in biology is not the free lunch approach, is more expensive lunch, because so from physics to biology, that critical transition is really how to use expensive lunch to maintain the system which is broken the general physical law in such a way in terms of the pattern formation, because evolution, when the evolution is evolved, just speed up the process for the complexity to become even more complex, because the use biological process, the use inheritance to not allow the system simply come back to the physical world. So that actually is we think is extremely important, is biological selection, evolutionary selection really amplifies the self-organization, because they use the package as an initial condition for the new evolution selection process. So in that way, in fact, it is biological, the lunch become more and more expensive. I mean, the animal, when they eat the animal, very expensive. But initially, you just exchanging information, energy from environment is much more cheap way. But that we thinking that, so therefore, this actually is quite fascinating, is because you mentioned when you put this, the isolate cell that do not reflect evolutionary memory. Of course, they're not. Because evolution select is a package, including the ecological system. So if we artificially disturb in such a system, right, we actually lock off the constraint, because evolution is all about constraint. When we lock off the constraint, the initial or the potential will be displayed, depends on our observation way. So therefore, for example, without a normal development process, we artificially put the cell there. They have to have behavior. The behavior is a life behavior, even though it's in the wrong environment. So in such a case, where the one experiment will be more interesting is if you use initially cell from different stage of the so-called intelligence, and then you compare the behavior under the environment you are created. So that actually could really show you whether or not the historical feature will be reflected upon or not. So that is fascinating. Your experiment system is fascinating. Can actually really doing the experiment. Because, for example, one of the reasons people right now is very confused. They said, oh, cancer is, the reverse evolution. No, it's not reverse evolution. Initially, single cell don't have that complex genome. They don't have all the potential coding mechanism. So when they become cancer, they actually build a new tissue of the cancer that have nothing to do with single cell stuff. So the people just completely mixed up for the evolutionary phenomena and the evolutionary history. So every time if you change the ecological system, you're no longer talking about evolution. You're talking about artificially environment, the previously constrained feature actually come back or emerged as such. So actually that is I think is one of very interesting question to thinking about that, and to amplify the power of your system as such.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Henry. I think we should talk more about this. Unfortunately, I'm gonna have to go in about 2 minutes. I gotta get rolling. But let's talk some details afterwards.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Kate, do you want to try to sneak another?
Yeah, I just wanted to try to do better justice to Robert's question. And it gets back to the idea of fractal structures and the critical distribution of scale level dependence, right? He made the comment that 1 over F power spectrum, which is key here, is a signal. It is a signal of mind based on recursive self-referencing. And we talked a little bit about the laws of form, and that's where he's coming from here as something that's mathematical at the very base of everything we're talking about. It's how the form is actually established before it can be information or a transformation in some process. So his wisdom here, Robert knows a whole lot of stuff about natural numbers and harmonics and resonance, and he's getting at, oh, you do now. He's getting at something very deep in what Richard Watson, if he's still with us, is trying to do as well. And it's this idea that it's the resonance between the levels of scale that are generating that whole from the part to the whole at every, and you said something flippant about how some weird kind of organism made sense of noise. Well, the 1 over F structure is pink noise, and it is the signature all through critical systems. So Robert, I hope I know I've garbled it a little bit, but that's the mathematics that he's getting at. And I think it's really deep and profound, this idea of these forms and how it requires the paradoxical self-referential distinction making. I think that's a really productive direction to go in terms of the maths and the truths that it can provide.
That sounds great. Thank you. So maybe Robert, drop me an email at some point and let's talk about it. I'd love to hear what you have. I gotta get rolling, but that sounds really interesting. So thanks, Kate. I appreciate that.
Amazing. Mike, thank you so much for your time. We've had
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, everybody. It's an awesome discussion. Yeah, thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, guys. Well, we can.
Appreciate it. Good to see you all. Good to see you all.
Take good care of yourself, Mike.
Appreciate it. You too. Bye, everybody. See you.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Okay, guys. Well, I've got to go in 5 minutes, but if anyone else has anything to talk about for 5 minutes, I'm game. That certainly was a wonderful meeting. I really appreciate you guys.
I've got to run. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Awesome. Okay, guys.
You too. See you, Charlie. Great job.
I'll see you later. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.
Thanks so much, Charlie. This is great.
Wonderful.